Hi, my name is Emily Kneebone. I'm Assistant Professor of Ancient Greek Literature and Culture at the University of Nottingham. And today we'll be thinking about Eros, so the personification of love or desire or sex in the ancient world and specifically in ancient Greece. So we'll be thinking about different aspects of the god Eros or the personification or the emotion, and we'll talk in a moment about how those are linked in the Greek imagination. So we'll be starting off by thinking about different ways in which Eros was mythologized, was imagined as a person or as a force in the ancient world. So what kind of god is Eros? We'll be thinking secondly about the ways in which Eros is conceived of as a figure who disturbs or unsettles established power hierarchies, that he kind of causes chaos and has a power well beyond his apparent size and importance. And then finally we'll be thinking in a bit more depth about an ancient text, a novel that dramatises the power of Eros, that represents a kind of exploration really of what it means to be in love or to feel desire and how that plays out in ancient relationships. So first of all, this question of Eros, who he was as a god. So he's the Greek god of love, desire and sex, equivalent to the Roman Cupid, although Cupid doesn't quite have the full force of the Greek Eros. It was the more important god. Cupid has been sort of downgraded a bit by the time you get to the Roman period. We have a mosaic depicting him on the right, and that's one of the typical kinds of representations of Eros. So a small boy, a toddler sometimes, with wings, going about various kinds of activities, often as here associated with other spheres, including Dionysus and the grape harvest. He's particularly thought of in connection with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, so the equivalent of the Roman Venus, and in many accounts Eros is said to be her child. They come together. He is a sort of messenger figure who can do her bidding and things like that. So there's an association of these deities associated with love, sex and desire. So Eros causes people to fall in love, and so his typical attributes, so the things that he holds, one of the ways in which you can recognise him is often that he's depicted with a bow and arrow. So he is said to strike people suddenly from afar. So you be going about your daily business and then suddenly you feel the arrow of Eros with no prior warning. And that's a really important way in which love and desire were thought about in the ancient world, was there's a tradition of externalizing these as gods, as figures who have a power and a decision-making capacity all of their own. It's not that you yourself necessarily fall in love with somebody, or at least that's not how it's represented often in literary texts in particular, but rather the god strikes you completely out of the blue, a sort of thunderbolt idea, if we want to draw a parallel with modern culture, the idea that suddenly you're struck. One of the difficulties about Eros is that he loves to cause trouble in the ancient imagination. It's actually not at all pleasant to be struck by Cupid or Eros's arrow. It causes immense pain and anguish and soul searching. You kind of almost feel a sort of sickness or a disease in a lot of ancient poetry. So early lyric poetry, you'll have seen that if you've read any Sappho, but other poets as well, think about almost the symptoms of love sickness. So the ways in which you kind of get inflamed, you feel a kind of fire within you. There's sleeplessness, there's a kind of restlessness, that this arrow propels you into kind of unusual activities or behaviours, or a sense that things are not as calm and serene as they used to be. The other thing Eros does beyond strike you at all is that this arrow can sometimes strike you in a very one-sided way. So it's not that two people are linked together at the same time by Eros's arrow, and that can cause all sorts of problems if one person loves and the other doesn't, and so on. So there's almost a delight in Eros's part in manipulating people into kind of doomed love affairs, or causing them to fall in love with somebody who doesn't love them back. And that is the stuff of a lot of tragedies and myths and disasters in ancient mythical terms. And importantly, Eros as a term, as a Greek term, can be used both for the god, this imagined figure who strikes you from afar with his arrow. Sometimes he's represented with a pine torch, so kind of a burning flame, again representative of that kind of burning passion, which is a very common metaphor in ancient Greece. But Eros can be used for this god, but also for the emotion of desire as well. And actually, in the way ancient Greek was written, it's not always easy to distinguish those, because they didn't have quite the same system of differentiating with capital letters and small letters as we do. So if we put love with a capital L, you can imagine a god. With a small l, you can imagine it more as your own emotion. In the Greek world, it's much more blurry. And the same is true of Aphrodite as well, actually. So there is an interest in tracing through the ways in which a god's external action can map on to your own desires. And people who aren't quite sure whether a god has sort of interfered or not are trying to figure out what on earth is going on with them when they've suddenly got these new strange emotions taking them over. So we've got this image then of Eros as a child, very mischievous. So it's not a coincidence that he's a child. He's sort of often imagined almost as a toddler, causing absolute havoc. If any of you have ever been in the path of a toddler, you can imagine the kind of havoc, the chaos, the destruction, the sense that actually there's a kind of selfishness in his action. He takes delight in causing trouble no matter the consequences. Again, very often associated with children not thinking through the long, it's not that Eros necessarily has a long-term rational plan, he's very often just out to cause mischief. But this is not an early Greek image. This is an image that comes in the Hellenistic period, so around the kind of 4th to 3rd and onwards century BC. And actually we have a very different image of Eros before that. So in early Greek literature, so the earliest literature to mention Eros as a god is Hesiod's Theogony, so roughly contemporary with Homer, so we're dealing with about the 8th or 7th century BC. And this represents Eros much more as a kind of force associated with the kind of very formation of the universe. So this version of Eros has him not as a little child, but as in fact almost the earliest of the gods. So older than Zeus and older even than Zeus's grandfather. So before Zeus was even thought of, before the Olympian order existed, we have Eros. So Eros emerges pretty much at the same time as the earth itself, out of chaos. Again, that kind of association of Eros with chaos, even though this sense of chaos can be more like a sort of chasm or an abyss, and roughly the same time as the earth. So this Eros is a force that structures the universe. It's a force that brings things together. It's about almost a kind of philosophical principle of attraction between elements, between opposites, between two different things. And Eros is imagined partly as a god, but partly also as a kind of principle of attraction. And this is what gets played out later in philosophical and medical terms. So we can think of Eros as the kind of the thing that brings things together. So Hesiod describes Eros as the most beautiful of the immortal gods. There's a tendency, of course, to think about Eros and Aphrodite as beautiful because beauty is so associated with love. The limb melter, so a figure that causes you to lose control over your own body. It no longer responds in the way that it used to. who overpowers the mind and the wise plans of all gods and all human beings. Now that's really important as well. So Eros, no matter whether we conceive of him as a kind of a cosmic, early primordial force, one of these figures like night or chaos or earth or sky, or whether we think of him as a sort of small mischievous toddler with a bow and arrow, overpowers all other gods. And this is something that the Greeks love to think about, the way in which the power of desire really cuts across all of the other hierarchies that pertain amongst human beings and amongst the gods. So even Zeus, the most powerful of the gods, the ruler of gods and men, is represented in ancient Greek thought as frequently being the victim of Eros. So we have lots of texts that think about Eros as a kind of a toddler leading this really powerful, regal king of gods and men, simply because Zeus in ancient mythology was sort of enslaved to his own desires. So he's always falling in love with or desiring particularly human women, but others as well, and then sort of going to all sorts of ends to sort of have relationships with those women. So this is a text from the imperial period that kind of dramatises a dialogue between Zeus and Eros. So Eros says, "You should let me off, Zeus. I suppose it was naughty of me, but I'm just a little child, honestly, a silly child." So Eros there playing the part of the small toddler who doesn't really know what he's doing and can't be blamed for the consequences of it. Now Zeus says, "You, a child? You're older than time." So he associates him with the very early stages of the formation of the universe. "Just because you have no beard and no grey hairs, you old rogue, are you going to pretend still to be a child?" So what this author is doing is playing for comic effect the idea that we've got two different conceptions of Eros. We've got the tiny child and the force that's as old as time. Normally those are kept separate in different texts, but here Lucian, who's a satirist and a humorist from around the 2nd century AD, is really playing up the comic potential for these two different Eroses to be the same figure. So Eros says, "Well, old rogue as I am, what have I ever done to you? Why should you think of putting me in chains? Why should you reassert your dominance as the king?" Zeus says, "Ask your own guilty conscience what harm. The pranks you've played on me. You've made me turn into everything under the sun. Satyr, bull, swan, eagle, shower of gold. But you've never made one woman fall for me, and I always have to use magic and hide my true self to please them. They've plenty of affection for the bull or the swan, but if they see me as I really am, they're frightened to death." And there's a joke there about the one figure, Semele, who did try to see Zeus in his full form. She was tricked into it by Hera, and it was too much for her, and she sort of got burnt up by the thunderbolt, which is supposedly the full true form of Zeus. So Zeus is then complaining about the indignity, the humiliation of constantly being forced to, or sort of turning himself into, metamorphosing into all these different kinds of creatures in order to have relationships with all the mortal women that he does. Now, in the Greek world, it's really important that the gods have relationships with human beings, even if only briefly, because that's how heroes are created. So it's an important part of the mythological scheme that there is a connection between the divine and the human realms, and that comes about because Zeus is so often prone to having, relationships or sleeping with various women. Not just Zeus, other gods as well, but Zeus is a particularly bad offender. So we have then a text here that plays with different conceptions of Eros. And just finally, and this is something we'll explore in greater depth in the session, I want to think about a text from a similar period, so the first couple of centuries AD, that really explores some of the complexities of what it might mean to talk about Eros and to fall in love. And this is a Greek novel. Now, the novel is the kind of primary form of writing in our era, but in antiquity it only really came into play in the first few centuries AD. Where quite rapidly they developed a very kind of canonical, a set way of writing in this particular genre of fiction. So we have 5 of these novels that survive in full. And the plot is very similar amongst all of them. So boy meets girl, everything looks great, then trouble. So they get separated, there are kidnappings, there are pirates, there are love rivals of all kinds, there are misunderstandings, one person thinks the other person's dead, they're about to commit suicide, and then at the last minute it's all saved, and so on. The plots are fiendishly complicated, but really, really interesting. But in each of these novels, there are kind of mini adventures or, enormous adventures that take them all the way across the inhabited world from the Greek or Roman perspective, before finally everything settles down and the hero and heroine are either married or reunited and live happily ever after. So the novel that we'll be thinking about is Longus's novel called Daphnis and Chloe. It's about 2 teenagers from the countryside, and it's a novel that's dedicated to Eros, really unusually. There's a preface that talks about this as a sort of a gift, a votive offering to Eros. And the whole novel explores what love means and how it's experienced, and really about the different ways of thinking about what love or desire means, both in theory and in practice. So these are 2 teenagers, as I say, who fall in love, but they have no idea what's happening to them. So they're young and they're kind of rustic, they're not very educated, and they cannot work out what is happening to start with because they've got no experience in love, they've never been taught about it. They fend off various rivals and threats, and essentially they try to have sex, but they can't work out how to do it. They get instruction from an old man, Philetus, who tries to tell them about Eros, but he gives them a very philosophical, he sort of gives a version of Plato, or this kind of mythological version of Eros, that accords with a lot of what we know about kind of Greek myths about Eros, but isn't actually of a lot of practical help. So in a way, the novel is thinking about that gap between the mythological Eros and what it's actually like to fall in love with somebody and to, think about having a kind of physical and emotional relationship with them. Eventually, Daphnis, who's still trying to work out how to have sex with Chloe, gets a little bit more practical help from a neighbour who initiates him into the ways of love. And at the end of the novel, Daphnis and Chloe are married. They choose to stay in the countryside and look after their flocks, even though it's revealed that they actually are themselves kind of the children of wealthy city dwellers who've just been brought up by foster parents in the countryside. So some of the themes we're thinking about in this session are, what does this text explore about how love worked in ancient relationships? So Eros is represented almost as conducting an experiment. So is nature or culture more important when thinking about love? Are relationships and love a natural instinct, or do we have to be taught through culture, through education, through convention? Where does the language of love come from? The metaphors we use, the ways we articulate what is happening to us when we fall in love. This is something that the protagonists, the hero and heroine, are struggling to do all the way through the novel. And actually we watch them reach for certain ancient Greek cliches about what love feels like. What kind of obstacles can stand in the way of a reciprocal relationship? It's really important to these novels that this relationship is mutual, that the boy and the girl love one another and love one another equally. So we get an exploration of what can go wrong. So even though they all end up happily, there is a lot of pain and loss and a sense of betrayal along the way. The novel really thinks about how do we understand about this world of love, sex and relationships? It turns out in this novel not to be automatic at all. They are trying to work out how to behave with one another and even how to have sex. There's a lot of exploration in this novel about the ways in which things that we think of as entirely natural, like falling in love or sort of having sexual relationships, are not in fact instinctive, that you have to be taught various ways of behaving. One of the most interesting aspects of the novel, I think, is the way it explores how men and women experience desire, and the ways in which, particularly as the young woman grows up, she learns what society expects of men versus what it expects of women. So there are a series of kind of double standards or expectations, particularly around fidelity and around virginity. And finally, the novel explores why people marry in the ancient world. So a lot of these novels have figures or obstacles in the way of that relationship, and very often that is the expectation that one or other of the protagonists will marry someone of a different station, or perhaps somebody that has been selected by their family. And there's a lot of exploration in this novel of the economic advantages of marrying particular people, and there are times when that comes very much into conflict with what the actual couple themselves want. So this is a period where both of those ways of choosing a partner were in operation, but very much coming into conflict in certain cases. So these are issues that we'll be thinking about a little bit more in the session. So we'll be thinking about different versions of Eros, the ways in which Eros unsettles power hierarchies, and particularly we'll be focusing on this experiment of whether love in kind of ancient novels and in Longus' Daphnis and Chloe is a question primarily of nature or of culture. So do join me for the session.